6 people died in the Maldives in May of 2026, and now the Maldives is rewriting its rulebook. For decades, for as long as the Maldives had been one of the world's premier dive destinations, technical diving in those waters existed in a gray zone. Not legal, not illegal, just not covered. The recreational limit was 30 meters. Technical diving simply wasn't in the legislation. Operators who conducted deep dives did so in a regulatory vacuum that nobody in authority had bothered to fill, because nobody in authority had felt the urgency to fill it. It took 5 Italian scientists and a Maldivian soldier dying in an underwater cave to create that urgency. The Maldives government has now confirmed it is drafting a brand new law, what it is calling the Tech Rec legislation, that would, for the first time, create a formal legal framework for technical diving in the country. Permits, certifications, minimum experience standards, operator accountability, safety protocols, everything that was absent on the morning of May 14th, all of it now being written into law because of what happened that morning. This is the Consequences episode. This is the part of the story where we find out what 6 deaths actually changed. And in this video, we are going to cover a lot of ground that the earlier parts of this series could not cover, because the consequences take time to become visible. The law being drafted, the emails under investigator scrutiny, the 6-hour decompression detail that nobody has properly explained on this channel yet, the Italian president honoring the Finnish divers in a ceremony that drew tears from the people who watched it, the full story of Sergeant Mahudhee's funeral that we never told properly, and our updated analysis of where accountability actually sits, now that we know more than we did in parts 1, 2, and 3. Now before we get into it, if you are new here, parts 1, 2, and 3 are linked up above and in the description. This video assumes you know the story. We're not starting from the beginning, we are following it to where it has now arrived. And if this series has been useful to you, please subscribe and hit the bell. Part 5 will come when the toxicology reports or the GoPro footage findings finally become public. That video will likely be the one that settles what the investigation has spent months trying to determine. You don't want to miss it. Now, let us talk about the law. Now, to understand why the Maldives is now drafting a technical diving law, you first have to understand the legal situation that existed before May 14th, 2026. The Maldives has long been one of the most celebrated dive destinations in the world. Whale sharks, manta rays, spectacular reef walls, blue water drift dives through channels so rich with marine life that even experienced divers describe them as unlike anything else on Earth. The country's economy depends enormously on dive tourism. Liveaboards operate across nearly all of the atolls. Dive centers at every significant resort. The industry is enormous. And yet, the regulatory framework governing diving in the Maldives had a gap that even industry insiders acknowledged had existed for years. Recreational diving was clearly governed. The 30-meter limit, operator licensing, tourist dive procedures. These existed and were reasonably well understood, if not always rigorously enforced. Technical diving had no framework at all. Not banned specifically, not explicitly permitted, just absent from the legislation. If you were a technical diver, using a rebreather, breathing trimix, planning a dive to 60 or 70 meters, there was no clear legal pathway through which to do that in the Maldives. No permit that you could apply for as a technical diver, no certification requirement that applied to operators running technical expeditions, no safety oversight specifically tailored to what happens when divers go significantly deeper than 30 meters. What filled that gap was informal practice. Experienced operators and experienced divers made their own judgments. Some of those dives were conducted carefully with proper technical equipment by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Others were conducted more casually, by people who understood the depth limits of recreational diving, but treated their additional experience as sufficient substitutes for the formal technical framework that did not yet exist. The Italian group on May 14th operated in that gap. They had a research permit for 50 meters, deeper than the recreational limit. They had institutional affiliations. They had logged thousands of dives between them. And they had no formal technical cave diving framework requiring them to carry specific equipment, to deploy a guideline, or demonstrate the specific certification level that a dive to 60 meters in an overhead environment demands. The regulatory gap did not kill them. Their equipment decisions killed them. But the regulatory gap meant that nobody with authority was required to ask the question that might have prevented the dive from happening the way that it did. Are these specific people with this specific equipment legally authorized to make this specific dive? Nobody was required to ask. And so, nobody asked. Chief Government Spokesperson Mohammed Hussein Sharif, speaking at the government's weekly press briefing, confirmed what the industry had suspected for years. Technical diving had been happening in Maldivian waters in an informal gray zone, and the government had decided that legal clarity, operator accountability, and safety oversight were better than another tragedy with no enforcement framework underneath it. He was not being diplomatic, he was being accurate. The proposed tech rec legislation would introduce the following: certification requirements for divers, meaning that you would have to demonstrate specific technical qualifications before being permitted to conduct deep technical dives in Maldivian waters. Operational standards for operators, meaning that a liveaboard or a dive center running technical expeditions would need to meet defined standards for equipment, emergency preparedness, and safety protocols. Permits for the dives themselves, meaning that a dive like the one on May 14th would require explicit government authorization, rather than operating under a general research permit that did not specifically cover cave penetration diving. Safety oversight for researchers and experienced technical divers, meaning the scenario where a group of academics with research credentials and general diving experience could self-authorize a cave dive at 60 meters without any specialist oversight would no longer be legally possible. The Scuba News, reporting on the draft legislation, noted that the Maldives had been one of the few global dive destinations where technical diving was strictly prohibited in formal terms, and yet it happened regularly in practice. The new law represents the government's acknowledgement that prohibition without enforcement had simply created a vacuum, and that vacuum had been filled by informal practice that carried no legal accountability when things went wrong. For the global technical diving community, this represents a significant shift. The Maldives has deeper wrecks and cave systems than most recreational divers ever reach. If the tech rec legislation is implemented as described, it could open formal pathways for rebreather expeditions, cave exploration, and technical liveaboard trips that have never had a legitimate legal structure in the country before. But that's the future. The present is an investigation, and the law being drafted now will not bring back the people who died because the law didn't exist before. There is something almost unbearable about that timing. The rules that would have governed the May 14th dive did not exist on May 14th. They are being written now, in the weeks after, in response to what happened. The law that should have been there was not there, and 6 people are dead in the space where the law should have been. Now, we want to spend time on a detail that's appeared in the reporting but has never been properly explained, including in our own previous videos. And it's one of the most devastating technical details in this entire story. Patrick Gronqvist, in his interview with Finnish broadcaster YLE, said this: "In order for the Italian group to ascend safely from 60 meters, they would have needed 6 hours of decompression stops because of the gas that they were using in their tanks." 6 hours. Let that land for a moment before we explain what that means. In recreational diving, most dives operate within what's called the no decompression limit. This is the maximum time that a diver can spend at a given depth without being required to make mandatory decompression stops on the way back to the surface. With that limit, a diver can ascend directly, slowly and carefully, but without stopping at specific depths to off-gas dissolved nitrogen. At 30 meters, the no decompression limit on standard air is approximately 20 minutes before decompression obligations begin. At 40 meters, it drops to around 10 minutes. At 60 meters, the depth the Italian group was operating at inside the second chamber, the no decompression limit on standard compressed air is approximately 3 to 4 minutes. 3 to 4 minutes. That is the entire window within which the group could have turned around and begun a direct ascent without incurring decompression obligations. They were not in the cave for 3 to 4 minutes. By the time that they were trying to exit the second chamber and find their way out, they had almost certainly been at or near 60 meters for long enough to accumulate significant decompression obligations. Not a minor obligation that a brief safety stop could manage. A substantial obligation. And here's what that meant in practice. They did not have the gas to fulfill it. Gronqvist confirmed that their tanks lasted approximately 10 minutes at that depth. 10 minutes of usable gas in the second chamber. Under the rule of thirds, the fundamental cave diving gas management principle, they should have turned around after roughly 3 minutes. But even if they had turned around at that exact moment and began a perfect ascent, they would have needed 6 hours of decompression stops to safely eliminate the dissolved gas in their tissues. 6 hours on tanks that lasted 10 minutes. This is the arithmetic of the disaster. It's not just that they ran out of gas trying to navigate out of the cave. Even if they had found the correct exit immediately and had begun ascending without delay, the gas that they had with them could not have covered what their bodies needed to surface safely. The decompression obligation that they had accumulated simply by being at that depth for the time that they were there exceeded what any recreational gas supply could accommodate. This detail does something important. It shifts the weight of the tragedy away from the wrong turn in the dark, which was the immediate cause of the 4 divers' final location, and towards the dive plan itself. The wrong turn made their specific position worse, but the gas situation was already critical before the wrong turn even happened. They were at a depth on equipment that could not support a safe exit under almost any realistic scenario by the time that they were trying to leave. Gronqvist's framing that the divers broke multiple rules before they ever entered that cave is made more precise by this detail. It was not just that they lacked a guideline. It was not just that they wore the wrong clothing. It was that the fundamental mismatch between the depth that they reached, the gas they carried, and the time that they spent at depth had created an unsurvivable arithmetic before the optical illusion ever even sent them in the wrong direction. Now, in part 3 of this series, we had mentioned the University of Genoa's claim that diving during scientific missions had been forbidden since March of 2024, more than a year before the May 14th dive, while new security protocols were being finalized. That claim, made publicly by the university after the tragedy, has now become one of the most contested elements of the entire investigation. Italian outlet L'Unione Sarda reported that emails between Monica Montefalcone and the University of Genoa are now under scrutiny by investigators. The specific focus of that scrutiny has not been publicly detailed. Investigators have not released the contents of any correspondence, and doing so during an active criminal probe would be legally inappropriate. But the fact that those emails are being examined tells us something important about what investigators believe that they might find. The question those emails are being used to answer is straightforward. Did the university know about the nature of the dive that Monica Montefalcone was planning? The university's public position is clear. They say diving was banned under their protocols from March 2024 onwards. They say that the dive on May 14th was personal, not part of the official scientific mission. They say they cannot be held institutionally responsible for activities that were explicitly prohibited under their internal rules. The Montefalcone family's lawyers have taken a different view. They expressed surprise, publicly and on record, that the university would claim to be unaware of diving activity given the annual nature of these Maldives expeditions. Monica Montefalcone had been leading coral reef research in the Maldives since 2013. These were not one-off trips. They were annual scientific cruises conducted by her department over more than a decade. The family's lawyers are essentially suggesting that an institution that sent the same researcher to the same location year after year for research that centrally involved marine diving cannot credibly claim that it had no knowledge of the diving activities occurring during those expeditions. That is the tension that the emails are being used to resolve. If the emails show that Monica corresponded with university administrators about the dive, even informally, even in passing, it becomes significantly harder for the university to maintain the position that this was purely personal and unknown to the institution. If the emails show nothing relevant, then the university's position is strengthened. We do not know which of those things the emails show. Investigators do. And whatever they show will be relevant to the question of whether the culpable homicide investigation in Rome eventually names a target beyond the individuals who were on the dive itself. And there's also the parallel strand of accountability being examined through a different set of documents. Investigators are looking at whether the cave dive was pre-planned, meaning organized in advance rather than a spontaneous decision made that morning. Whether it was officially declared to any authority, whether technical equipment or continuous cave guidelines were intended to be used, and, critically, whether the fatal dive was connected to the official coral research project on which Montefalcone and Odenino had been engaged, or whether it had been a genuinely separate private initiative. These are not academic questions. Under Italian culpable homicide law, the difference between a pre-planned institutional activity and an entirely private decision made on a personal day off has significant legal implications for who bears responsibility. The operator of the Duke of York, Abdul Muhsin Musa, has stated publicly that the vessel had permission for recreational dives and that he accompanied the divers up to the 30-meter recreational limit. He has implicitly distanced himself from any suggestion that the operator authorized or facilitated what happened below that depth. His liveaboard's license remains suspended, with the Ministry of Tourism citing the absence of a dive school permit as the specific reason. That detail, the missing dive school permit, is separate from the question of whether the cave dive was authorized. It means the Duke of York was conducting dive-related operations of any kind without the specific license that the law requires for those operations. That's a regulatory violation that exists independently of what happened on May 14th, and it may create its own civil and criminal liability for the operator, regardless of what the investigation ultimately concludes about the diver's decision-making. We've covered Mohammed Mahudhee across 3 episodes of this series. We've described how he died. We've said that he was a professional, a trained military diver, a man who went into that cave to bring someone else's colleagues home. We've not told the story of his funeral properly, and we want to do that now. Sergeant Major Mohammed Mahudhee of the Maldivian Coast Guard was buried with full military honors on May 16, 2026. 2 days after the Italian group entered the cave. The day after, Mahudhee himself died in ADK Hospital in Malé following the decompression sickness that he developed during the recovery operation. President Mohamed Muse was in attendance. Thousands of people paid their respects. Not just military personnel, civilians. Members of the public who had followed the rescue story and understood that this man had gone into a dangerous place to help people he did not know and had not come back. Foreign ambassadors attended. Tourism officials attended. The people of the Maldives came to say goodbye to a soldier whose name many of them had only learned in the hours after his death. The MNDF lowered its flag to half-mast at all bases for 2 days. After the funeral, President Muse held a separate ceremony at Bandara Koshi, the presidential complex, honoring Maldives Police Service and MNDF personnel who had participated in the operation. Certificates of appreciation were presented. The country's leadership formally acknowledged what these people had done, and what one of them had given. These are the rituals that a country uses to say, we see what this cost. We know what it required. We will not let it be forgotten. Mahudhee was 43 years old. He had served in the Maldivian military for 20 years, 4 months, and 27 days. He survived by 2 children. Those facts, 20 years of service, 2 children, the precision of that 4 months and 27 days in the official accounts, those are the kind of details that appear in military records and nowhere else. They are not details that make headlines, but they are the details that tell you who a person actually was, beyond the role that they played in a story that the rest of the world was following. He was not a supporting character in the Italian diver's tragedy. He was a man with 2 decades of service and 2 children and 20 years of commitment to a uniform, who was asked to go into a dangerous cave and went, who did his job in an environment that nobody on that operation was properly equipped to manage, who developed decompression sickness and was transferred to a hospital and didn't survive. The cave did not distinguish between the Italian group who entered it voluntarily and the soldier who entered to bring them home. It applied the same rules to both. Now, on the other side of the ledger, if there can be said to be another side in a story like this, there is the recognition that Italy extended to the people who went in after. Italian President Sergio Mattarella personally awarded Sami Pekkarinen, Jenny Westerlund, and Patrick Grönqvist the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic, one of Italy's highest civilian honors. The award is formally described as recognition of merit acquired toward the Italian nation in the fields of literature, the arts, economy, and in activities pursued for public benefit. 3 Finnish cave divers received it for going into a cave in the Maldives and bringing 5 Italians home. The Order of Merit has been awarded to scientists, artists, diplomats, and heads of state. It has been given for lifetime bodies of work and for singular acts of distinction. Pekkarinen, Westerlund, and Grönqvist received it for what they did between May 18th and May 22nd, 2026. 4 days of diving in conditions that one of them described as the most frightening of his life. They had waived all financial compensation for the mission. They had removed their guidelines from the cave before leaving, in an act of considered professionalism that prevented any future diver from treating those lines as an invitation to enter. They had spoken carefully and publicly about what they found, with a restraint and respect for the victims and their families that was notable given the international attention the story was receiving. And now, Italy's head of state has placed that honor in their hands. Pekkarinen, in interviews after the recovery, had said that he intends to return to the Maldives to map the cave properly. He said that an accurate map is the only way to prevent further deaths at the site. A cave that kills people because its unmapped dead-end corridor looks like the exit, that's a cave that's going to kill again, under the same conditions, if nobody documents its real shape and then makes that documentation available. He went in to bring the dead home, and he plans to go back to protect the living. Now, beyond the law being drafted and the investigations being conducted, the May 14th tragedy has sent shockwaves through the Maldivian dive industry in ways that are only beginning to be visible. Dive operators who run liveaboards and resort-based operations across the atolls, they're facing an environment of heightened scrutiny that many describe as unprecedented. The Duke of York's license suspension, issued by the Ministry of Tourism, sent a signal to every operator in the country that having the right paperwork matters, and that the absence of specific permits creates exposure that the government is now willing to act on. The dive school permit question is the most immediate practical concern. The Ministry of Tourism confirmed that the Duke of York was operating without a dive school permit, a license required for any vessel that assists clients with diving activities. If other liveaboards are in a similar position, the regulatory environment has just become significantly more serious. Australian Leisure Management, covering the industry implications of the tragedy, noted that the disaster creates challenges for dive operators that go beyond simple regulatory compliance. The story raised questions about what operators are required to do when they become aware that clients aboard their vessel are planning dives that exceed their vessel's permitted scope. Is an operator legally obligated to prevent those dives? Does carrying equipment on board that could facilitate a deeper dive create liability if that equipment is used for an unauthorized dive? These questions do not have settled answers in Maldivian law. They are the questions that the new technical diving legislation is, at least in part, being drafted to answer. And there's also the reputational dimension. The Maldives markets itself globally as a safe, well-regulated paradise for recreational divers. The deadliest diving accident in the country's history, which exposed a regulatory gap that the industry had been navigating informally for years, is not a story that operators want international media running when potential customers are deciding where to book their next trip. The pressure to demonstrate that the Maldives has learned from this, and that the new legal framework will be meaningfully enforced rather than just existing on paper, is substantial. The Scuba News asked a question directly in a follow-up article to the initial tech wreck legislation story. The Maldives wants technical diving. Is it ready? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine one. Creating a legal framework for technical diving is one thing. Building the enforcement infrastructure, the inspection capacity, the trained oversight that personnel needed to make that framework real rather than theoretical, that's considerably harder. And given that the tragedy on May 14th happened in part because a regulatory gap existed and was not enforced, the credibility of whatever replaces that gap depends entirely on whether the enforcement is genuine. Now, in Part 3, we gave you our honest interpretation of what happened inside that cave. We said that it was not simple recklessness. We said that it was a chain of individually reasonable-seeming decisions that compounded into something unsurvivable. We said the domino effect framing, narcosis, gas, visibility, time, each one worsening the next, was the most accurate description available. Nothing in the new information changes that core analysis, but several things have sharpened it. The decompression detail sharpens it the most. We now know, confirmed by Gronkvist, that the dive plan as executed required 6 hours of decompression on tanks that lasted 10 minutes. That arithmetic was established before the wrong turn, before the optical illusion, before the silt rose and the darkness closed in. The mismatch between the depth, the gas, and the time was already fatal in its implications before any navigational error was made. This means that the most important decisions in this story, they were made before the divers even entered the water. Not inside the cave, not at the sandbank, not at the moment that somebody turned left instead of right. The critical decisions were made on the surface, when equipment was selected, when no guideline reel was packed, when the rule of thirds was not applied to the dive plan, when nobody said clearly, "This dive requires gear we do not have." The emails add another dimension to the accountability question. We have said from the beginning that this is not a simple story of one villain making one reckless decision. But we are increasingly of the view, based on what has been confirmed, that the accountability for this tragedy is distributed across several layers rather than just concentrated in one place. There's the individual layer, the decisions made by the divers themselves with their knowledge and their qualifications and their equipment on the morning of May 14th. And then there's the institutional layer, the University of Genoa's role, its internal diving ban from March of 2024, and the question of whether it had knowledge of what its researchers were doing in the Maldives on research trips that it funded and facilitated. And then there's the operator layer, the Duke of York's missing dive school permit, and the question of what the operator knew or should have known about the nature of the dives being conducted from their vessel. And finally, there's the regulatory layer, the absence of a technical diving framework that might have required authorization, oversight, and equipment standards for a dive of this nature before it was permitted to happen. None of these layers fully exonerates the others. None of them, taken alone, fully explains the tragedy. That is the honest picture. The investigation may eventually concentrate responsibility more clearly in one direction, but based on what we currently know, this looks like a failure at every level simultaneously: individual, institutional, operator, and regulatory. A chain in which every link held just barely enough to allow the next link to be reached, until the last link broke. We have been covering this story since May of 2026. We've watched each development add detail without yet adding the definitive answer. The toxicology results will be the next significant piece. We have covered every source that's been made public. We are as confident as we can be at this stage of the investigation in the analysis that we've just given you. When something changes, when the toxicology results or the GoPro footage findings or the investigation conclusion shifts the picture, we will be here with Part 5. The Maldives is writing a new law. Italy has opened a criminal investigation, has seized electronic devices, and has examined autopsy results that found no physical trauma and now await toxicology to determine the cause of death. 3 Finnish divers have been awarded the Order of Merit by Italy's president and plan to return to map the cave so that what happened on May 14th cannot happen the same way again. A Maldivian soldier was buried with full military honors, with thousands in attendance, while his 2 children watched. And 5 families in Italy are still waiting for the complete answer. In the weeks since this story broke, we have been asked by many of you, is it disrespectful to cover this story in such detail? To analyze what went wrong? To examine the decisions and the systems and the regulatory failures? Our honest answer is no. We think the opposite's true. The 5 Italian divers who died in Vanox were not careless people. They were scientists. They were researchers. They spent their professional lives trying to understand and protect the marine environment. Monica Montefalcone spent more than 20 years diving in the Maldives, contributing to scientific knowledge that outlasts her. Muriel Odenino published scientific papers about marine biodiversity. Federico Guattieri was a recent graduate beginning what should have been a career. Georgia Somica was 23 years old. They deserve to be remembered properly, not as cautionary tales that were flattened out into a single lesson, not as victims who've been defined only by the manner of their deaths, but as real people whose deaths exposed real failures in real systems, and whose story, told carefully and honestly, might contribute something to preventing the next group of curious, experienced divers from walking into the same set of compounding circumstances. Pakarinen said that he is going back to map that cave so that it never takes another life the same way. We cover these stories for the exact same reason. The investigation continues. The toxicology results are complete, but not yet public. The GoPro cameras are in Maldivian custody. The emails are being examined. The tech wreck legislation is being drafted. The culpable homicide probe in Rome is active. When the next significant development breaks, and it will, we will be here. Subscribe if you want to be here too. And if you have thoughts on our analysis, agreement, pushback, questions, corrections, comments are where that conversation belongs. We read them. Some of the best corrections to this series have come from people in those comments who know more about cave diving than we did. That's how this should work. This is part 4. Story's not finished.